Donc nous sommes page 36. Suppose that Jack and Jill have equal resources and that they are otherwise roughly similar in every way except in respect of the beliefs I am about to mention. They are both healthy, neither handicapped, both reasonably successful in their chosen occupations, neither outstandingly accomplished or creative. They take roughly the same enjoyment from their day-to-day life. But Jack, who has been much influenced by genre painting, thinks that any ordinary life fully engaged in projects is a life of value, while Jill, perhaps because she has taken it to heart, is much more demanding. Jack thinks, for example, that the life of a busy peasant who achieves very little and leaves nothing behind is full of value, while Jill thinks that such a life is only full of failure. If each is asked to assess the overall value of his or her own life, Jack would rate his high and Jill hers low. But there is surely no reason in that fact for transferring resources from Jack to Jill, provided only that Jill would then rate her life, while still of little overall success, a bit higher. It might seem that the difficulty this example exposes arises only from the fact that our procedures attempt to compare judgments of value reached on the basis of very different theories about what gives value to life, which is like comparing apples and oranges. Someone might object that we would do better if we asked Jack and Jill each to make comparative judgments using their own standards for each comparison, and then compared these comparative judgments in some way that would neutralize the difference in their philosophical convictions. This is, I think, a mistake, but we should explore the suggestion nevertheless. We might ask Jack, for example, to compare the value, in his eyes, of his present life with the value of the life he would have under whatever conditions of physical and mental power and whatever collection of material resources and opportunities at his disposal he would take to be ideal. Or we might ask him to compare in this way his present life with the life he would have under what he would take to be the worst conditions. We might ask him how far his life is better than the life he would have if he had no or very few resources or opportunities. We would then put the same questions to Jill, or we might ask each a rather different sort of question, not asking them to imagine different material circumstances, but rather to compare their present lives with lives in which each would find no value at all. I owe this last suggestion to Derek Parfit, and through him, I understand, to J. P. Griffin and J. Mahon. We might ask each how far his or her life exceeded, in its value, that life, and so on. Once some one of these questions, or perhaps some weighted group of them, had been selected as for some reason especially appropriate for the purpose, equality of overall success, as a political ideal, would recommend redistribution until either the proportion of or the flat amount hypothetically reported by way of answer was as close to the same in all cases as could be achieved in that way. I should say at once that there is room for doubt, at least, whether all or possibly even any of these various questions could actually be answered, or be answered by any but the most philosophically inclined respondents. I shall set the doubts aside, however, and assume that people generally have a sufficient grasp of theories of value to be able intelligently to answer them. But of course the different comparisons, the different questions prompted might, if each was harnessed to the ideal of equality of overall success, yield different recommendations for redistribution. Suppose, for example, that Jack thought his present life much better than the worst life he could imagine, but also much worse than the best life, while Jill thought her life not much better than the worst and not much worse than the best. Then the direction of redistribution would depend on which of these two comparisons was thought more important for comparing levels of overall success. Even if all the answers to all the questions we could invent pointed in the same direction for redistribution, we should still have to show that at least one of these questions was the right question to ask. When we look more closely at the questions I listed, however, they turn out to be very much the wrong questions. Suppose Jack and Jill, who, as I imagined, are now roughly equal in resources and enjoyment and relative success in their chosen lives, do disagree radically in judgments about how much more valuable their lives would be if they had everything they could have, for example. Jack believes that with all these resources he could solve the riddle of the origin of the universe, which would be the greatest imaginable achievement for human beings, while Jill believes that riddle unsolvable and has no comparable dream in hand. So Jack believes his present life is only a small fraction as good as what it could ideally be, but Jill believes her life is not that much worse than what it could possibly be. Surely we have no reason of equality here for transferring resources from Jill to Jack, destroying their assumed quality of resources and enjoyment and relative success, even if such a transfer would cause Jack to rank his new life as having come somewhat closer to his ideal solving the riddle life. Suppose Jack considers his present life much more valuable than any life he would consider to have no value at all, while Jill thinks her life just barely better, on any flat scale of valuing life, than a life she would think had absolutely no value, but that this is for the reason already suggested. Jack considers any life fully engaged and creative, with as much day-to-day enjoyment as his has an enormous value, something to be treasured and protected and pursued. He can imagine a life about which he would be indifferent, but it is a life so impoverished that he has no trouble reporting that his life is better than that by a very long chalk. Jill has roughly as much day-to-day pleasure or enjoyment. She's not depressive, but rather very demanding in her idea of what life could be deemed a really successful life. She cannot say, when asked seriously to consider this great question in a philosophical mood, that she thinks her life, for all its apparent richness, is in fact a life of much real value. She can easily imagine a life that she would believe had absolutely no value, and cannot say that she honestly thinks her life is really, all things considered, much more valuable than that one. Once again, it seems implausible that equality demands that resources be transferred from Jack to Jill. Why are all these comparative questions so plainly the wrong questions to ask? Because we have not in fact escaped, in switching from flat questions to comparative ones, the difficulty we found in the former, because the differences between Jack and Jill we have noticed are still differences in their beliefs, but not differences in their lives. There are differences in their speculative fantasies about how good or bad their lives would be under very different and bizarre circumstances, or differences in their philosophical convictions about what could give great value to any life. But not for that reason a difference in what their lives now are. Each of the judgments Jack or Jill makes in responding to the different questions we put to them can be considered a judgment about the value or overall success of their lives. But they are not all the same judgment, and none of the judgments we have so far described seems appropriate for a theory of equality of overall success. I want now to suggest a comparison of the overall success in people's lives, very different from the comparison suggested in all these questions, that doesn't seem to be connected, at least, to problems of distributional equality. Differences in people's judgments about how well their lives are going overall are differences in their lives, rather than simply differences in their beliefs, only when there are differences not in fantasy or conviction, but in fulfillment, which is, I take it, as a matter of measuring personal success or failure against some standard of what should have been, not merely of what conceivably might have been. The important and presently pertinent comparison seems to me this: the more that people can reasonably regret not having done something with their life, the less overall success their lives have had. Reasonably, of course, carries much weight here, but it is all necessary. No one can reasonably regret that he has not had the life that someone with supernatural physical or mental powers, or the lifespan of Methuselah would have had. No one has a less successful life, all things considered, just because he thinks that such a life would be infinitely more valuable, in the philosophical way, than the life he has. But people can reasonably regret that they have not had the normal powers of the normal span of life that most people have. No one can reasonably regret that he has not had the life that someone with an unfairly large share of the world's resources would have led. So no one person's life is less successful than another's because the first thinks his life would be much more valuable in those circumstances, while the other does not. But people can reasonably regret not having whatever share of material resources they are entitled to have. Perhaps the point is now clear. Any proposed account of equality of overall success that does not make the idea of a reasonable regret or some similar idea pi- pi- pivotal in this way is irrelevant to a sensible theory of equality in distribution. It may develop a concept of overall success useful for some purpose, but not for this purpose. But any proposed account that does make this idea pivotal must include, in its description of equality of overall success, assumptions about what a fair distribution would be, and that means that equality of overall success cannot be used to justify or constitute a theory of fair distribution. I do not mean simply that equality of success could not be applied in some cases without having an independent theory of fair distribution as a supplement for such cases. If the point were only that, then it would show only that equality of overall success could not be the whole story in a theory of distribution. The point is more striking. Equality of overall success cannot be stated as an attractive idea at all without making the idea of reasonable regret central. But that idea requires an independent theory of fair shares of social resources. This might, for example, be the theory that everyone is entitled to an equal share of resources, which would contradict equality of overall success not in some cases only, but altogether. Suppose someone contests this important conclusion in the following way. He concedes that the aim of equality of success, properly conceived, is to make people equal in what they have reasonably to regret. But he believes that the idea of reasonable regret can be elucidated in some way that does not require any theory of fair share of resources other than some version of or refinement of the equal success theory itself. It might propose the following: people cannot reasonably regret that they are not leading the life of someone with supernatural powers, or the life of a successful sadist, or a life in which they have resources such that, with those resources, they could achieve a life with less reasonably to regret than others can have with the resources then left for them. This will not do, however. We aim to make people equal in what they have reasonably to regret. Suppose, as before, that Jack and Jill have equal resources. Jack has, as we saw, grand ambitions, and, though he does not believe himself entitled to anything in particular, will always regret not having more than he does. We want to know whether Jack and Jill are nevertheless equal in what they have reasonably to get. On the proposed test, we must ask Jack, or ask ourselves from his point of view, how far the life he can now lead falls short of the life he would lead if he had, among other things, the amount of resources such that if he had those resources he would have the same amount reasonably to regret as others would then have. Jack cannot answer that question, nor can we. He can pick some different distribution at random, say a distribution in which he has $1 million more and others in the aggregate $1 million less. But he cannot tell whether his new distribution life is a proper baseline against which to measure his present life without knowing whether the reasonable regret he would feel with one more million is no more than others would reasonably regret with what they could then have, and he cannot tell this without picking some further new distribution at random, in which perhaps he has 2 million more, against which to compute his regret at the 1 million more life, and so on into infinite regress. We cannot, of course, repair this failure, as we try to repair other failures, by some trial and error device. For the problem is not that we can offer no non-circular algorithm for reaching an initial distribution to test, but rather that we can offer no method for testing any distribution however reached. In the case of some people, but not Jack, we might be able to find an amount of resources such that their actual regret at not having more is so weak that we do not need to compute their reasonable regret as that amount to say that the latter must be less than the actual regret that others would have if the former had that amount. But many questions arise even then. Is it not necessary still to compute the reasonable regret as distinguished from the actual regret of the latter group before deciding that the former group may not have more than that amount? Can this be done without regress? In any case, the total of amounts fixed as maxima for particular people in this way would undoubtedly exceed the total available for distribution. I shall not pursue these complexities further. I conclude that reasonable regret cannot itself figure in the distributional assumptions against which the decision whether some regret is reasonable is to be made. Nor can I think of any other conception or refinement of equality of overall success that can fill that role. If so, then the goal of making people equal in what they have reasonably to regret is self-contradictory in the way I described. I do not mean that comparisons of fulfillment or of how far different people have been able to make a success of their lives in their own eyes have no place in discussions of equality. Many differences in overall regret, many occasions that people have properly to regret what they have not done, flow from handicaps of bad luck or weakness of will or sudden changes, too late for anything but regret in people's perceptions of what they really take to be valuable. But it is perhaps the final evil of a genuinely unequal distribution of resources that some people have reason for regret just in the fact that they have been cheated of the chance others have had to make something valuable of their lives. The ideas of fulfillment and of reason for regret are competent to express this final argument against inequality only because they are ideas that reflect, in their assumptions, what inequality independently is. I cannot, of course, prove that no one will invent a test or metric for overall success that will be both pertinent to equality and independent of prior assumptions about equality in distribution. For that reason, I considered a fairly wide variety of suggested tests of this sort, hoping to show why I think it unlikely that one can be found. Certainly nothing that I am aware of in the present literature will do. But now suppose someone defending equality of overall success concedes that no such distribution-independent test can be found. I have been assuming that he must then concede that equality of overall success is useless as a distinct political goal because, insofar as it recommends changes from the independent distribution it assumes to be fair, it must recommend distributions it condemns as unfair. But is this too quick a conclusion? Suppose he argues that we must distinguish between the measure and the means of achieving equality of overall success. He might suggest, for example, that a fair distribution for purposes of computing some person's present overall success is an equal distribution of resources. We compute Jack's and Jill's overall success by asking how far each regards his or her life as less successful than the best life he or she could have if resources were shared equally in society. If Jack's overall success, so measured, is greater than Jill's, we transfer resources from Jack to Jill so far as we can thus reduce the difference. It is true that Jack and Jill will not then have equal resources. Jill will have more resources than Jack, but they will be more equal in overall success as measured in the proper, reasonable, regret-oriented way. There is no contradiction in using the idea of equal resources internally within the metric for determining overall success, and then actually distributing so as to achieve equality of overall success rather than equality of resources. But this reply misses the point. The reasonable regret metric for determining overall success makes assumptions about what distribution is fair, about the distribution to which people are entitled. If that metric assumes that a fair distribution is an equal distribution of resources, and Jill is then given more than an equal share, she is given more than the theoretical argument supposedly justifying the transfer says is her fair share. Of course, Jill might not complain about having more than the share of resources to which he is, by hypothesis, entitled. But Jack will complain about having less than the justification assumes he is entitled to have, and the only way to give Jill more than that share is to give Jack or someone else less. Je fais equality of enjoyment plus tard. Je vais manger.